There is something happening inside your chest right now that you are almost certainly doing wrong, and the frustrating part is that nobody ever told you it was wrong because it looks completely normal from the outside. You breathe in, you breathe out. It feels automatic, and it is, and that is exactly the problem. Because when breathing stays automatic, when it stays unconscious and fast and shallow, your nervous system never gets the signal it is waiting for. It stays in a mode it was never designed to stay in permanently. And the consequences of that show up in your focus, your sleep, your anxiety levels, your heart rate variability, your immune response, and even your ability to learn new things under pressure. What I want to show you today is the mechanism behind all of that, because once you see it clearly, you will never think about your own breath the same way again. If this is the kind of video that makes you want to go deeper, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because this channel covers exactly the science that most people never get explained to them properly. Now let's build this from the ground up. The first thing I want you to understand is that your nervous system has two major operating modes, and almost everything about how you feel on any given day, how calm you are, how sharp your thinking is, how well your body recovers from stress, depends on which of those two modes is running the show. The first mode is called the sympathetic nervous system. You have probably heard it described as the fight or flight response, which is accurate but incomplete, because the sympathetic system is not just something that activates when you are being chased by something dangerous. It activates anytime your brain detects a threat, and the modern human brain has been trained by decades of unrelenting stimulation to detect threats constantly: phone notifications, deadlines, background noise, unread emails, social uncertainty, financial stress. None of those things are a lion in the grass, but your nervous system cannot always tell the difference. The second mode is called the parasympathetic nervous system, sometimes called the rest and digest response. And this is the system responsible for recovery, digestion, immune regulation, cellular repair, deep sleep, emotional processing, and the kind of calm, focused attention that most people are desperately trying to find through coffee and productivity apps. Here is the critical thing that most explanations of this topic completely skip over. These two systems are not equal in how they are controlled. The sympathetic system, the one that drives stress and activation, can be triggered almost instantly and involuntarily by almost anything your brain perceives as a signal of danger. But the parasympathetic system, the one that brings you back down, the one that repairs and restores and regulates, is much more selective. It responds to very specific physiological inputs, and the most powerful, most direct, most accessible of those inputs is the speed and depth of your breath. This is not a metaphor. This is not relaxation advice dressed up in scientific language. There is a specific anatomical reason why slow breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and it has a name, and once you understand it, the logic becomes impossible to ignore. That anatomical reason is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the human body. It travels from your brainstem down through your neck, through your chest, through your heart and lungs, all the way into your abdomen, connecting your brain to nearly every major organ in your body. The word vagus comes from the Latin word for wandering, and that name is accurate, because this nerve wanders through more of your body than almost any other single neural structure. Here is what matters for what we are talking about today. The vagus nerve is the primary highway of the parasympathetic nervous system. When vagal tone is high, meaning the vagus nerve is active and well regulated, your parasympathetic system is dominant, your heart rate is steady, your digestion works properly, your inflammatory response is regulated, your mood is stable. When vagal tone is low, the sympathetic system takes over by default, not because anything dangerous is happening, but simply because the brake system has gone quiet. Now, here is where the breath comes in, and this is the part I really want you to hold on to. Your diaphragm, the large dome-shaped muscle that sits below your lungs and drives breathing, is directly laced with vagal nerve fibers. When you take a slow, deep breath in, the diaphragm descends, the lungs expand, and the stretch receptors embedded in the lung tissue send a signal up the vagus nerve toward the brainstem. But the signal that has the most dramatic effect is not the inhale, it is the exhale. During a slow, extended exhale, something called the Herring-Breuer reflex activates, and vagal tone increases measurably. Your heart rate actually drops. Not metaphorically, not as a feeling, but in a way that shows up on an electrocardiogram. This is a phenomenon called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and it is one of the most well-documented physiological responses in cardiovascular science. Researchers like Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory has reshaped how we understand the nervous system, and Luciano Bernardi, who published landmark work in the British Medical Journal on slow breathing and autonomic function, have spent decades documenting exactly this mechanism. The research is not fringe. It is replicated across dozens of studies involving thousands of participants. What it shows consistently is that when breathing slows below roughly 6 breaths per minute, which is about 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out, the heart and the respiratory system enter a state of resonance. The variability in your heart rate, which is a direct measure of parasympathetic activity, increases significantly. Your nervous system is not just calmer in that moment, it is actively being trained. And that word trained is important, because this is not just an in-the-moment effect. The research on heart rate variability, the field of science that measures the flexibility and responsiveness of the autonomic nervous system, shows clearly that people who practice slow diaphragmatic breathing consistently over weeks and months develop measurably higher baseline vagal tone. Their nervous systems become more resilient. They recover from stress faster. They sleep more efficiently. They show lower baseline levels of inflammatory markers in their blood. The slow breath is not just a relaxation technique. It is a training stimulus for the neural system that governs almost every physiological process your body runs. And the reason the training effect is so significant is something that most people do not appreciate about the vagus nerve. Approximately 80% of the fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent, meaning they carry signals from the body upward to the brain, not the other way around. Your gut, your heart, your lungs, your immune tissue, they are all sending a continuous stream of information to your brainstem and to your prefrontal cortex, shaping your perception, your mood, your sense of safety, your cognitive clarity. When that incoming stream says slow, expanded, rhythmic, the brain interprets the body as being in a state of safety and competence. When that stream says fast, shallow, irregular, the brain interprets threat and calibrates every downstream system accordingly. Changing your breath is not a secondary strategy. It is upstream of almost everything else. Now I want to flip this around, because understanding why slow breathing works requires understanding what fast breathing is actually doing to your nervous system. And most people have never had this explained to them. The average American adult breathes somewhere between 14 and 20 times per minute at rest. That number, which sounds unremarkable, is actually physiologically significant. When breathing is fast and shallow, the dominant mechanical input to the vagus nerve is not the deep diaphragmatic stretch that activates the parasympathetic response. It is a pattern of rapid, chest-level contractions that keeps the sympathetic system primed and on standby. Fast breathing does something else that most people do not realize. It tends to overclear carbon dioxide from the blood. Carbon dioxide is not just a waste gas. It plays a direct role in regulating cerebral blood flow. When you exhale too quickly and too frequently, CO2 levels in the blood drop, blood vessels in the brain mildly constrict, and the brain can enter a state of low-grade hypersensitivity, that slightly edgy, unfocused, difficult to settle feeling that so many people normalize as just how they are. Researchers like Peter Litchfield, who has done extensive clinical work on breathing dysfunction, and Nina Bickford, who studied breathing patterns in anxiety disorders, have documented how chronically elevated breathing rates can perpetuate anxiety and hypervigilance, even in the complete absence of any external stressor. The nervous system has been primed by the breathing pattern itself. This is a loop that most people do not know they are in. The stress activates fast breathing. The fast breathing reinforces the physiological state of stress, which activates more fast breathing. The entry point for breaking that loop is not changing your thoughts. It is not making the stress disappear. It is changing the mechanical input your vagus nerve is receiving, and you do that with the breath. The reason slow breathing trains your nervous system faster than most other interventions is precisely because it bypasses the cognitive layer entirely. You do not have to convince your brain that things are okay. You are changing the signal at the hardware level. You are talking directly to the brainstem in its own language. If you have made it this far and you are finding this useful, the most helpful thing you can do right now is save this video so you can come back to it, because what I am about to explain is the piece that ties everything together. There is a specific breathing frequency that researchers have identified as producing the maximum parasympathetic response in most adults. It is called the resonance frequency, and it sits at approximately 0.1 Hz, which translates to about 6 breath cycles per minute, roughly 5 seconds for the inhale, 5 seconds for the exhale. At this frequency, the oscillation of your breathing and the natural oscillation of your cardiovascular system synchronize. This is not an approximation or a rough estimate. It is a measurable phenomenon that you can observe in real time with the right equipment, and it produces what researchers describe as a dramatic amplification of heart rate variability. Paul Lehrer at Rutgers University has published some of the most rigorous work on resonance frequency breathing, showing that even 6 weeks of daily practice at this frequency produces lasting improvements in heart rate variability, reductions in blood pressure, improvements in asthma symptoms, and measurable reductions in anxiety and depression scores. The key insight from Lehrer's work, and this is the part that most people miss when they encounter breathwork advice, is that the benefits are cumulative and structural, not just immediate. The nervous system is being physically retrained. The connections between the brainstem, the vagus nerve, and the heart are being strengthened in a way that is analogous to how muscle tissue becomes stronger through consistent resistance training. You would not lift a weight once and expect your muscles to change permanently. You would not run a single mile and expect your cardiovascular fitness to transform. The same logic applies here. 6 breath cycles per minute, practiced consistently for 10 to 20 minutes per day, is a training protocol, not a coping strategy. And the distinction between those two things matters enormously, because a coping strategy helps you get through the moment. A training protocol changes what the moment feels like in the first place. The other thing that Lehrer's research makes clear is that the resonance frequency is not exactly the same for every person. It tends to cluster around 0.1 Hz, but some people are slightly higher, some slightly lower. The practical way to find your individual resonance frequency is to experiment with breath rates between 4 and 7 cycles per minute, and notice at which rate the sense of settling, the slowing and deepening of the physiological response, is strongest. Your body will tell you. The signal is not subtle once you start paying attention to it. Here is something that has been established in neuroscience for decades, but still has not fully entered popular awareness. The autonomic nervous system, which includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches and the vagus nerve, is plastic. It changes in response to repeated inputs in the same way that the motor cortex changes in response to repeated physical practice. This concept, which neuroscientists call autonomic plasticity, is the reason that chronic stress literally rewires the nervous system toward a default state of sympathetic dominance. People who have lived through prolonged periods of high stress do not just feel anxious. Their nervous systems have been physically calibrated toward vigilance. The baseline vagal tone drops. The threshold for threat detection lowers. The recovery time after stressors increases. The system has adapted to the environment it was given. But adaptation is bidirectional. The same plasticity that allows chronic stress to push the nervous system toward a dysregulated state also allows consistent, targeted input to push it back. This is where slow breathing becomes something more than a wellness trend. It becomes a clinical tool. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leading researchers on trauma and the nervous system, whose work has been documented extensively in peer-reviewed literature and in his widely cited book on the body's role in storing traumatic experience, has repeatedly pointed out that top-down cognitive approaches to nervous system regulation, like therapy and mindfulness alone, have limits. The body itself must be engaged. The breath is one of the most direct routes to that engagement because it is simultaneously voluntary and autonomic. You choose to slow it down, but once you do, the physiological consequences are not up to your conscious mind at all. They happen in the brainstem, in the heart, in the immune cells lining your gut. You initiate the action. The nervous system runs the program, and if you run that program consistently, the default state of the program begins to change. I want to be specific about what actually improves when someone trains their nervous system through consistent slow breathing, because vague claims about stress reduction and relaxation are not useful, and they are not accurate enough to capture what the research actually shows. Heart rate variability increases. This is the most direct and measurable marker of parasympathetic health, and it predicts a remarkable range of outcomes, including cognitive performance under pressure, immune function, cardiovascular health, and resilience to depression. Studies published in journals including Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback have shown HRV improvements in ranges of 20 to 40% in regular practitioners of resonance frequency, breathing over periods of 6 to 12 weeks. Sleep architecture improves. Specifically, the proportion of slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most restorative stage of sleep, tends to increase in people who practice slow diaphragmatic breathing regularly. The mechanism is straightforward. The parasympathetic state is the biological prerequisite for deep sleep entry, and a nervous system with higher vagal tone transitions into that state more efficiently. Inflammatory markers decrease. Cytokines including interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, both of which are elevated in states of chronic sympathetic dominance, show measurable reductions in slow-breathing practitioners, which has implications not just for how people feel day to day, but for the long-term disease risk that chronic low-grade inflammation creates. Cognitive function under stress is preserved better. Research from the HeartMath Institute and from military and emergency responder training programs has documented that individuals with higher HRV maintain more accurate decision-making and faster processing speed under high-pressure conditions than individuals with lower HRV. The nervous system that has been trained to recover quickly does not lose access to executive function the way a chronically dysregulated one does. Let me give you the actual protocol, because this conversation needs to end with something you can use. The practice is simpler than most people expect. You sit or lie comfortably in a position where your back is supported and your chest is not restricted. You place one hand lightly on your belly, just below the navel. You breathe in slowly through your nose for a count of 5 seconds, and you focus on allowing your belly to expand outward before your chest rises. The expansion of the belly is how you confirm that the diaphragm is doing the mechanical work, rather than the accessory muscles of the chest and neck, which tend to take over during the shallow, rapid breathing pattern that most people default to under stress. You exhale slowly through your nose or through lightly pursed lips for a count of 5 seconds, allowing the belly to fall naturally as the diaphragm releases. That is one complete cycle. You repeat it continuously for 10 to 20 minutes. The time of day matters less than the consistency of the practice. Morning sessions tend to establish the parasympathetic baseline that influences the autonomic tone of the remaining hours of the day, and many people who practice in the morning report that their default physiological response to stressors changes meaningfully within a few weeks. Evening sessions tend to accelerate the transition into deep restorative sleep, particularly for people whose minds are difficult to quiet at night. Many people find genuine value in both, and the research on HRV improvement is dose-responsive, meaning more consistent daily practice produces more robust structural adaptation within reasonable limits. What matters most in the early stages is not precision, it is repetition. Your nervous system requires sustained, repeated exposure to the input before structural changes begin to accumulate in a lasting way, exactly as muscle tissue requires repeated resistance stimulus before visible adaptation appears in the tissue. The research consensus is that meaningful baseline improvements in vagal tone are measurable after approximately 3 to 4 weeks of consistent daily practice. Not months, not years, weeks. The system is more responsive than most people realize, and it has been waiting for this specific input for longer than you probably know. Every single time you take a slow, deliberate breath, you are sending a signal through 200 million years of mammalian evolutionary architecture directly to the part of your brain that decides whether the world is safe or dangerous, whether your body should repair or defend, whether your mind should settle or scatter. That signal is not symbolic. It is not a mindfulness metaphor. It travels through a physical nerve, the longest in your body, at a measurable speed, and produces documented physiological consequences that researchers can observe on monitoring equipment in real time. The breath is the most underused tool in human biology, not because the science is unclear, and not because the practice is difficult, but because nobody showed people the mechanism clearly enough to make it obvious why 10 minutes of slow breathing is one of the most structurally significant things a person can do for their long-term neurological health. The mechanism is what makes the behavior make sense. And when behavior makes sense at a mechanistic level, it stops requiring willpower to sustain. It becomes something you do because you understand what it is actually changing. That understanding is what smart psychology exists to give you. If this gave you something worth keeping, subscribe and leave a comment below telling me what part of this shifted how you think about your own nervous system, because those comments genuinely shape what gets explored next. Your question might become the subject of the next video that changes how someone else understands their own biology.